October 23, 1951. At 2:30 in the morning, Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa sat in heavy darkness, the kind that settles before sunrise. Inside a small wooden crew hut, First Lieutenant Fred Meyer leaned over his navigation desk, marking coordinates that would soon send his B-29 Superfortress toward one of the most dangerous regions in the world. Outside, mechanics moved around the aircraft with quiet urgency, checking engines that had carried the United States to victory in World War II. Now, those same engines were preparing for a challenge they had never been built to face. After the mission briefing, Meyer wrote a short, cold line in his diary. Was supposed to go on R&R, briefed for Namsi mission instead. In a separate letter to his wife Libby, he told her to cancel the Buick order, ending with a simple sentence that revealed more than it seemed. "I don't think you would have liked it anyway." Their target was dangerously close to the Chinese border, less than 30 miles away, where more than 100 Soviet MiG-15 jets were waiting at bases the United Nations was not allowed to strike. The B-29, once considered untouchable over Japan, was now flying into skies controlled by faster, higher-climbing aircraft flown by skilled pilots. These were the same bombers that had dropped more explosives than any other aircraft in history, burned 67 Japanese cities, and delivered the atomic bombs that ended the war. But 6 years later, that record of dominance was about to collapse. 9 B-29s from the 30th Bombardment Wing prepared for takeoff, each carrying 11 crewmen who trusted the legendary aircraft beneath them. Their confidence came from history. The B-29 had once flown beyond the reach of enemy fighters, protected by advanced gun systems that helped it destroy hundreds of attacking planes. Its raids had leveled Tokyo in a single night and forced Japan to surrender without an invasion. The Korean War, however, had introduced a new reality. The Soviet-built MiG-15 was faster, sharper, and far more capable than the U.S. expected. Within 6 hours of takeoff, the Namsi mission would earn a grim name, Black Tuesday. 3 B-29s would be destroyed over the target. 3 more would return so badly damaged they would never fly again. Nearly 67% of the attacking bombers would be lost, the highest destruction rate of any major American bombing mission. The long-standing belief that the B-29 was untouchable was about to collide with advanced Soviet engineering and veteran pilots who knew exactly how to bring down large bombers. The aircraft itself had been a technological marvel. It represented the most expensive U.S. military aircraft program of World War II, more costly than the Manhattan Project's atomic program. In 1938, the U.S. Army Air Corps had asked for a bomber able to carry 20,000 pounds of explosives more than 2,600 miles at speeds near 400 miles per hour. Boeing responded with a design so advanced it changed bomber development for decades. The first XB-29 flew on September 21, 1942 from Boeing Field in Seattle. It introduced features that had never existed on a production bomber before. The aircraft had fully pressurized crew compartments connected by a narrow tunnel stretched over the 2 bomb bays, letting crew members move comfortably between sections while the outside air sat at -40 degrees. Its defensive system was equally revolutionary. Instead of traditional manned turrets, the B-29 used remote-controlled gun stations managed by analog computers built by Sperry. These computers calculated where the enemy would be by the time bullets arrived, allowing gunners to simply aim while the system handled the rest. 4 remote turrets with pairs of .50 caliber machine guns and a powerful tail position made the bomber a fearsome fortress in the sky. The aircraft was driven by 4 Wright R-3350 radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower. These engines pushed the 70-ton bomber to speeds up to 357 miles per hour. But power came with problems. The engines were temperamental and prone to overheating. On February 18, 1943, the second prototype crashed after an engine fire burned through a wing spar, killing renowned test pilot Eddie Allen and his crew. Despite the setbacks, General Henry Arnold demanded rapid production. 4 major factories, Boeing in Washington and Kansas, Bell in Georgia, and Martin in Nebraska, built thousands of parts supplied by companies across the country. The scale of production had never been seen before. By the war's end, 3,960 B-29s had been completed, many requiring immediate upgrades as new improvements were introduced. The B-29 saw its first combat in 1944, launching missions from India and China. Early flights showed both its strengths and weaknesses. Mechanical issues caused many losses, but its range, speed, altitude, and payload were unmatched. When the U.S. captured the Mariana Islands, the bombers gained access to bases within striking distance of all major Japanese cities. On March 9, 1945, the aircraft demonstrated its full destructive capability. That night, 334 B-29s struck Tokyo in the deadliest air raid in history. Under the command of General Curtis LeMay, the bombers flew at lower altitudes and carried incendiaries instead of high-explosive bombs. To increase payload, most defensive guns were removed. The resulting firestorm consumed 16 square miles of the city, killing around 100,000 people. The devastating effectiveness of the raid led to similar attacks on 67 Japanese cities over the following months. B-29s also dropped thousands of naval mines that crippled Japanese shipping and hastened the nation's collapse. Finally, on August 6th and 9th, specially modified B-29s, the Enola Gay and Boxcar, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, accelerating the end of the war. The remarkable success of earlier operations gave the United States Air Force a deep sense of certainty. B-29 crews believed their aircraft could withstand enormous damage, travel distances no other bomber could manage, and deliver destruction on a scale unmatched in history. The aircraft's ability to haul 20,000 pounds of bombs over roughly 3,500 miles, fly above 30,000 feet on a routine basis, and defend itself with guns that had torn apart countless Japanese fighters strengthened that belief. The superfortress had helped win the Pacific War. Many assumed it could face whatever the Korean conflict required. Lieutenant Colonel Earl McGill, who would eventually fly 28 missions over Korea with the 19th Bombardment Group and even survive a crash on takeoff, later described the mindset inherited from World War II. "We were convinced nothing could reach us at high altitude. The Japanese threw everything they had at us, and we still made it home. Sure, we lost planes to flak and breakdowns, but enemy fighters rarely threatened us. We expected the same story in Korea. We were terribly mistaken." The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops surged across the 38th parallel in a major assault on South Korea. The United States quickly committed air power to slow the offensive. B-29s were deployed to Far East Air Force's bases and assigned strategic bombing roles. At first, their missions met almost no resistance. Airfields, rail centers, bridges, and industrial sites across North Korea fell under B-29 bombardment with minimal losses. Through the summer and fall of 1950, superfortress crews continued flying daylight attacks with the confidence formed in World War II. Then, the situation changed abruptly. On November 1, 1950, Soviet pilots operating MiG-15 jet fighters under the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps confronted American aircraft over North Korea for the first time. These MiGs carried North Korean or Chinese markings, but the pilots inside were well-trained Soviet aviators. Their appearance introduced a technological challenge the United States was not prepared for. 9 days later, on November 10th, a MiG-15 destroyed the first B-29 lost to enemy fighters in the Korean War. The bomber was conducting strikes near the Yalu River when Soviet jets intercepted it. The fight lasted only seconds. Explosive 37mm Tannin shells ripped through one of the bomber's wings, igniting fires the crew couldn't control. 8 men parachuted out and were captured. 3 never escaped the aircraft. The loss alarmed commanders, but many believed it was a rare event. After all, the United States had the F-86 Sabre, a swept-wing jet built to confront the MiG-15. Sabre units were on their way to Korea and would soon escort the bombers. Commanders assumed these fighters would gain control of the sky, just as escorts had in World War II. This confidence ignored several essential realities. First, MiG-15 bases inside Manchuria were protected by political restrictions. United Nations aircraft were forbidden from crossing the Chinese border, which meant Soviet and Chinese pilots could launch from safe airfields, attack bombers over North Korea, and withdraw to bases that could not be touched. Second, the number of available F-86 Sabres was far too small. Fewer than 90 Sabres were expected to counter more than 400 MiG-15s flying from several airfields along the Yalu River. Third, and perhaps most important, the MiG-15 was built specifically to attack bombers. The F-86, while a superb dogfighter, was not optimized for intercepting incoming heavy aircraft at long range. The MiG's exceptional climb rate and high-altitude performance gave it major tactical advantages. Throughout the winter and spring of 1951, B-29 losses grew as Soviet pilots refined attack patterns designed to exploit every weakness in the bomber. MiG strikes damaged many superfortresses and destroyed several outright. Their tactics became increasingly efficient. MiG-15s would climb far above the B-29 formations, reaching a position the slower American escorts could not match. From this height, they would sweep downward at extremely high speeds, often more than 600 miles per hour, fire and pull away before U.S. fighters could react. The MiG's weaponry made these attacks deadly. It carried 2 23mm cannons and a single 37mm cannon. A 2-second burst from these guns could tear a B-29 apart. The 37mm rounds, each weighing over a pound and filled with explosives, were capable of destroying control systems, rupturing fuel tanks, damaging engines, and causing fatal injuries to crew members. In contrast, the B-29's 50-caliber guns, highly effective in World War II against slower piston-engine fighters, did not have the range or striking power to stop fast-approaching jets. Soviet pilots learned that head-on attacks offered the best chance of success. Approaching from the front meant the B-29 gunners had only moments to fire before the MiGs streaked past at combined closing speeds exceeding 800 miles per hour. Approaches from above and behind allowed Soviet pilots to target the wings, engines, and fuel systems while avoiding much of the bomber's defensive fire. On April 12, 1951, a day U.S. crews would later call Black Thursday, about 30 MiG-15s attacked a formation of 48 B-29s, escorted by nearly 100 F-50 Shooting Stars and F-48 Thunderjets, as they aimed for bridges across the Yalu River. But the Soviet jets were too fast. They struck the bomber formation and pulled away before the straight-wing American fighters could effectively respond. 3 B-29s were shot down, and 7 more sustained such severe structural and internal damage that they were removed from service after landing. Reports described holes blasted through wings large enough for a person to crawl through. Hydraulic systems were destroyed, forcing pilots to fly with heavy manual controls. Fires burned out engines. Electrical lines were cut, leaving crews to rely on emergency backups. Several airmen were wounded or killed by the exploding cannon shells. Not a single MiG was confirmed destroyed, a stark indicator of the overwhelming advantage the Soviet jets held. Claims from American crews did not match actual losses. The reality became undeniable. The F-48 and F-44, both straight-wing designs, were sufficient against North Korea's older piston-engine fighters, but could not keep up with MiG-15s. With top speeds of 580 and 622 miles per hour, they simply could not close the distance. Their climb rates were too low to challenge MiGs attacking from above. After Black Thursday, Far East Bomber Command halted daylight missions for nearly 3 months. When operations resumed, new tactics required tight formations, heavy fighter protection, and avoidance of the most dangerous areas near the Yalu River. But none of these adjustments could overcome the core issue. The B-29 had been designed for a different era of warfare. Built in the late 1930s to face propeller-driven fighters, the bomber was now meeting an opponent with entirely different capabilities. The MiG-15 could reach 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes, faster than a B-29 could drop to escape. It could fly at 670 miles per hour, almost twice the bomber's maximum speed of 357 miles per hour. Most importantly, its heavy cannons could tear a B-29 apart in an instant, while the B-29's defenses lacked the range and power to keep the jets away. Lieutenant Colonel Earl McGill spent 7 years researching the psychological strain faced by bomber crews, a journey he captured in his 2008 book, Black Tuesday over Namsi. He wrote candidly, "Everyone felt the fear. On my very first mission, the briefing warned us about intense MiG resistance. I was so terrified that nothing in my life afterward ever matched that feeling, not even the B-52 missions I flew during Vietnam." He described the atmosphere in the ready room. No jokes, no chatter. The man responsible for presenting the navigation route had previously worked as a funeral director, and he even delivered the briefing wearing the tall black hat from his old profession. It was grim humor, a way of acknowledging that some of them would not be returning. By October 1951, U.S. Air Force leaders faced a critical problem. North Korean forces were restoring airfields that would allow their fighters to operate closer to the fighting. If these runways became fully functional, they could threaten UN aircraft across the entire region. Commanders decided the only option was to destroy them with large-scale daylight strikes before construction was completed. Intelligence reports warned of heavy MiG resistance, but analysts believed the missions could succeed if enough escort fighters were available. For October 23rd, the chosen target was the Namsi airfield in northwestern North Korea near the city of Namsi. Reconnaissance photos revealed nearly complete runways, extensive construction work, and early warning radar systems being installed. Hitting Namsi required accurate bombing guided by the Shoran system, a radio-based method that allowed precision strikes even through cloud cover. Shoran, short for short-range navigation, relied on radio signals from island-based transmitters. To make the system work, the bombers had to fly in stable, predictable paths with no sudden evasive turns during the final approach. For MiG pilots, this meant something else entirely. American bombers would be forced into steady lines of flight, making interception almost effortless. Soviet aviators knew they would face targets unable to maneuver during the crucial minutes leading to bomb release. The 307th Bombardment Wing assigned to the operation understood that they would be painfully exposed. 9 B-29 superfortresses were selected for the raid. Each aircraft carried an 11-man crew: pilots, co-pilots, bombardiers, navigators, engineers, radio operators, radar specialists, and several gunners who operated the remotely controlled defensive turrets. Their average age was just 23. Many were reservists who had returned to civilian life after World War II, believing their combat days were long finished. Others were new airmen on their very first missions. All understood that flying into MiG Alley in daylight was the most dangerous assignment in the region. At 0230 on October 23rd, engines began to roar across Kadena Air Base, cutting through the quiet early morning air. Each B-29 used 4 massive R-3350 engines, producing 2,200 horsepower apiece, and spinning 4-bladed propellers more than 16 feet wide. Fully loaded, the bombers approached 70 tons, an astonishing weight for aircraft designed a decade earlier. Their plan required a 5-hour flight from Okinawa to the Korean coast, followed by a turn north into MiG Alley for the bombing run. Escort protection included 55 F-84 Thunderjets for close support and 32 F-86 Sabres for high-altitude cover. The straight-wing F-84s were slower than the MiG-15s, but invaluable in staying near the bombers. The Sabres, America's only fighters capable of matching MiG performance, would patrol above, attempting to keep enemy jets away from the formation. First Lieutenant Fred Meyer climbed through the front hatch of his assigned B-29, carrying maps, plotting tools, and the heavy responsibility of ensuring flawless navigation. Any miscalculation could send the formation out of range of their fighter escorts or off the shore-ran guidance arc. Meyer was a World War II veteran recalled to active duty, now navigating a bomber heading toward an opponent far more advanced than what he had faced years earlier. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Second Lieutenant Nick Karofis prepared the bomb sight and checked the ammunition for the forward guns. The engine flight engineer monitored engine readings, while the gunners inspected their turret systems one last time. In the center of the aircraft, Technical Sergeant Fred Spivey confirmed that the fire control computer and all gun stations were communicating correctly. At roughly 3:45, the first B-29 began its takeoff roll, burning fuel at an astonishing rate, nearly 100 gallons per minute. The runway lights dropped away as the heavily loaded aircraft climbed slowly into the night sky. 8 more B-29s followed at carefully timed intervals. Once airborne, they arranged themselves into 3 groups of 3, flying wedge formations designed to concentrate defensive fire and maintain mutual protection. The long crossing over the East China Sea passed quietly. Crews settled into the familiar rhythm of long-range flight, checking instruments, marking navigation points, and holding position with the rest of the formation. Cruising altitude allowed the pilots to use autopilot for brief stretches, though everyone knew that the real challenge would begin in a few hours when they reached North Korean airspace. At 0745, the formation crossed the Korean coastline. 2 hours still separated them from MiG Alley. Weather forecasts predicted thick clouds over the target, meaning they would rely entirely on shore-ran for bomb guidance. Every MiG pilot in the region would be watching radar screens, waiting for the incoming bombers. By 0955, all 55 F-84 Thunderjets had taken their escort positions. Powered by J-35 engines producing 4,000 pounds of thrust, the jets maneuvered around the bomber formation. Every pilot understood that their planes were no match for MiG-15s in turning battles, but their presence offered at least a sense of protection and a chance to disrupt the first wave of attacks. Moments later, 2 groups of 16 F-86 Sabres each lifted off from South Korean bases to provide high cover. These were the elite flyers, America's best hope of countering the MiGs. But 32 Sabres could not blanket the entire sky, and MiG commanders would search aggressively for weak spots in the defense. The bombers climbed to 20,000 feet, the ideal height for shore-ran accuracy. Although they could fly higher, this altitude offered the best balance between bombing precision and defensive capability. Flying lower made them more vulnerable, but missing the target was not an option. At about 0950, the shore-ran beacon stations on offshore islands began transmitting the signals that would guide the formation. The lead aircraft locked onto the system and adjusted its heading accordingly, while the others followed at carefully spaced distances. Maneuvering was no longer possible. They had to maintain steady arcs all the way to the target. Meanwhile, Soviet radar operators at Antung Airfield in China had been tracking the American formation since it crossed the coastline. MiG-15 fighters launched from multiple runways, climbing rapidly to positions above and ahead of the B-29s. Soviet controllers directed them with precise instructions: altitude, distance, angles, coordinating a multi-directional attack designed to strike all 9 bombers at once. At around 000 hours, the bomber crews finally saw them. MiGs glinting in the sunlight, forming up at high altitude. Silver shapes against the bright sky, accelerating quickly as they prepared to strike. Radio warnings erupted across the formation. The battle was about to begin. Within moments, every gunner in the formation had locked onto incoming targets, and each pilot tightened up formation spacing to strengthen their overlapping defensive fire. The F-86 Sabres high above tried to swing into position, but the MiGs held the advantage in both altitude and speed, allowing them to slip past the first layers of protection. Soviet-flown MiG-15s plunged toward the bombers at more than 650 miles per hour, opening fire at shockingly close ranges, sometimes only a few hundred yards. Their heavy 37mm explosive shells, weighing over a pound each, tore into the superfortresses with brutal force. The first B-29 struck in the opening pass suffered catastrophic wing damage. Fuel tanks ruptured, ignited instantly, and the aircraft commander told his crew to jump as the bomber peeled out of formation, trailing fire. More MiGs rushed in from multiple directions, saturating the sky with cannon bursts. A second B-29 was hit hard through its fuselage and left wing. One engine detonated, hydraulic systems failed, and the pilot struggled to maintain any control at all. He ordered his men to abandon the aircraft while he fought to keep it level long enough for them to escape. Inside Captain Fogler's B-29, navigator Fred Meyer recorded every attack as it happened, information that would later become official documentation. 4 attacks from the nose, 4 from tail chase positions, and 37 from the rear quadrant alone. The numbers climbed so rapidly it was hard to process them. MiGs hurtled past the bomber windows at combined closure speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. Some jets came so near that crewmen swore they could see the faces of the opposing pilots through the cockpit glass. Technical Sergeant Fred Spivey kept up a non-stop stream of 500 caliber fire, the gun barrels glowing from the heat. In the nose, Bombardier Nick Kaffes tracked a MiG climbing away after a low attack run. He unleashed several hundred rounds at the jet as it seemed to hover less than 100 yards out. Impacts flickered across the enemy aircraft's metal skin. The MiG wobbled, rolled over, and fell away trailing smoke, one of the very few successful defensive hits made during the entire engagement. The F-84 Thunderjets fought desperately to assist, but the MiGs simply accelerated out of reach. High above, the F-86 Sabres managed to engage several enemy fighters and scored victories, yet they were too few in number and too far away to break up the main attack. With more than 180 aircraft twisting through the sky, the clash turned into the largest aerial battle of the Korean War. The fighting raged for roughly 15 minutes. By the time the surviving B-29s released their bombs and turned back toward safer territory, the devastation was overwhelming. 3 bombers were shot down over enemy ground, their crews either killed or captured. 3 more were damaged so badly they barely managed emergency landings at K-14 Air Base near Seoul. Ground personnel at K-14 watched in disbelief as the battered aircraft limped in, smoke trailing, engines burning, control surfaces shredded by cannon fire. One B-29 landed with an engine still ablaze and its left main tires destroyed. It bounced hard on touchdown, bursting another tire, and skidded sideways toward onlookers who scattered as the bomber ground to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. Only 3 of the 9 B-29s returned to Kadena with damage considered repairable. The loss rate, 67%, was worse than some of the most disastrous missions of World War II. Commanders were shocked. How could the mighty superfortress, the aircraft that helped win the Pacific War, be torn apart so easily? The explanation was rooted in technology. The B-29 had been designed in the late 1930s to face piston engine fighters operating at about 20,000 feet. It was never meant to confront jets. But the jet age had arrived suddenly and violently. The performance gap was merciless. The MiG-15 climbed at more than 10,000 feet per minute, reaching firing altitude faster than a B-29 could dive to escape. It cruised at speeds the bomber could not match even at full throttle. Its cannons could ruin a superfortress with a short burst, while the B-29's defensive guns needed long streams of fire just to scratch the fast-moving jets. Within days of what became known as Black Tuesday, Far East Air Forces issued a historic directive. On November 1, 1951, all daylight B-29 missions over northwestern Korea were halted indefinitely. From then on, the superfortress would fly only under the cover of night, and even then, Soviet-trained night fighter pilots with radar and coordinated searchlights posed deadly threats. The age of mass daylight strategic bombing with propeller-driven aircraft had come to an end. Back in the United States, Strategic Air Command was preparing to field the enormous B-36 Peacemaker, a 6-engine bomber intended to carry nuclear weapons across continents. But the B-36 was even slower than the B-29, topping out around 435 miles per hour. If MiG-15s could shred superfortresses so easily, they would annihilate the Peacemaker long before it reached its targets. General Curtis LeMay, commander of Strategic Air Command, realized the implications immediately. In discussions at Offutt Air Force Base after the Namsi disaster, he made it clear the era of piston-engine bombers was over. Only aircraft capable of higher speed, greater altitude, and advanced electronic protection could survive the new type of air combat. The Boeing B-56 Stratofortress program, already in development, was pushed to the highest priority. Its design incorporated every lesson learned at the cost of lives over Korea. Powered by 8 J-57 turbojet engines, producing a combined 136,000 pounds of thrust, the B-56 would fly higher, faster, and farther than anything before it. With a top altitude of 50,000 feet and speeds approaching 650 miles per hour, it would operate beyond most interceptors. Its range of more than 4,000 miles without refueling, advanced countermeasures, radar warning systems, and defensive technologies represented a complete transformation from the B-29's generation. Although Boeing had received its initial development contract in 1948, the Namsi disaster accelerated everything: funding, schedules, testing. The first YB-52 prototype flew on April 15, 1952, even as B-29s continued to see action in Korea. The new aircraft demonstrated immediately that modern strategic bombing belonged to jets. The B-56 wouldn't enter full operational service until 1955, but its arrival guaranteed that when piston-engine bombers retired, they would be replaced by aircraft capable of surviving the kind of advanced defenses revealed over Korea. Meanwhile, the war continued with older bombers forced to fly only at night, but night missions introduced their own deadly threats. Soviet night fighter crews trained specifically to hunt bombers using radar-directed searchlights. North Korean units deployed hundreds of these searchlights around important targets, coordinated by ground controllers who could track approaching B-29s and guide both lights and fighters directly onto them. The bomber crews responded by painting their undersides black to reduce visibility. Even so, MiG pilots learned to search from above, spotting the reflective bare metal upper surfaces that remained visible despite the darkness. The personal stories that survived revealed the emotional toll on those involved. First Lieutenant Fred Meyer, the navigator who had recorded each attack as it happened, completed his tour and returned home permanently changed by what he had endured. In letters to his family discovered decades later, Fred Meyer described the mental toll of watching comrades perish in blazing aircraft while he survived by mere feet and seconds. He wrote that the nightmares lingered for decades. Technical Sergeant Fred Spivey, the central fire control operator who had engaged multiple MiGs during the mission, was credited with probable enemy kills. Awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, he seldom spoke of it afterward. At a reunion in 1985, when asked about Black Tuesday, he simply said he had done his duty and been lucky. Many of his fellow crew members were not so fortunate. Those who survived parachute landings over North Korea were captured, spending the remainder of the war in harsh camps along the Yalu River. Soviet and Chinese intelligence interrogated them relentlessly, seeking technical details of American aircraft, tactics, and equipment. Food was scarce, medical care inadequate, and permanent health damage was common. The Soviet pilots involved received official recognition at home, yet they were forbidden to discuss their combat service. For decades, Soviet records denied that their pilots had even participated in the Korean War, claiming only Chinese and North Korean aviators engaged in combat. It was not until the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, that veterans spoke publicly and archives were released. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Smortskov, a Soviet ace credited with 12 kills, including at least one B-29, later described the tactics in Soviet MiG-15, aces of the Korean War. "We took off in poor weather, formed in clouds, and found the bombers exactly where ground control predicted. Head-on attacks left their gunners almost no time to react. The superfortress was powerful, but it could not maneuver like a fighter, and our cannons could destroy it with one good burst." Statistics from the Korean Air War remain debated. American sources claim F-86 Sabres achieved kill ratios of up to 10-1 against MiG-15s, while Soviet records suggest much closer parity. Both sides likely overclaimed in the chaos of high-speed jet combat, where multiple pilots might fire on the same target. What is undisputed is that MiG-15s were devastatingly effective against B-29 bombers. By 1953, B-29s had largely shifted to night harassment missions, dropping smaller bomb loads on isolated targets to disrupt supply lines. The mass daylight raids of World War II were gone, replaced by cautious operations acknowledging the bombers' vulnerability to jet fighters. Of roughly 90 B-29s lost during the Korean War, 16 were confirmed destroyed by MiG-15s, with dozens more damaged beyond repair. The lessons of Korea spurred rapid modernization. The B-52 Stratofortress entered service in 1955, becoming the backbone of Strategic Air Command's nuclear deterrent. The B-36 Peacemaker, already outdated, retired in 1959. Fighter design shifted to higher speeds and altitudes, leading to aircraft like the F-104 Starfighter capable of Mach 2 and operations above 60,000 feet. Soviet aviation also advanced. Success with the MiG-15 directly led to the MiG-17, MiG-19, and MiG-21, each generation faster and more capable. Soviet bomber design abandoned piston engines entirely, producing the Tu-16 and Tu-95 jets with missions comparable to American strategic bombers. The Korean Air War profoundly shaped Cold War military aviation. The human legacy endures in the memories of veterans and their families. In 2008, 67 years after Black Tuesday, surviving American crew members met at a Korean War reunion in San Antonio, Texas. Few remained, but those who attended shared stories once too painful to tell. Watching friends burn alive, facing an enemy impossible to outrun, and carrying survivor guilt for decades. Fred Meyer, the navigator who counted every attack during the mission, attended at age 84, bringing his original flight log. The yellowed pages still legible, he read aloud the entry for October 23, 1951. Supposed to go on R&R, but briefed for MiG Alley mission, Namsi Airfield. He looked up and said, "We thought we were invincible. We were wrong. It cost good men their lives to learn that lesson." The strategic implications were profound. The Namsi mission proved that technological superiority could shift rapidly, and assumptions based on past victories could be deadly. The B-29, once the most advanced bomber with pressurized cabins, remote-controlled turrets, and sophisticated fire control systems, was no match a decade later to jets flying twice as fast and striking with far more powerful weapons. American military planners were forced to confront hard truths. Air superiority could no longer be assumed based on numbers or historical success. Superior technology, training, and tactics determined outcomes. The confidence born in World War II was shattered over North Korea on that cold October morning in 1951. Lessons were absorbed quickly. Funding for jet bombers surged, and missile defense research accelerated, acknowledging that even the fastest aircraft could become vulnerable. Strategic bombing evolved from mass daylight raids to precision strikes with smaller, highly capable forces using advanced electronics and countermeasures. By the Korean War's armistice on July 27, 1953, lessons had been fully integrated. B-29s had flown over 21,000 sorties, dropping 167,000 tons of bombs. But high losses and the abandonment of daylight operations proved that the era of the propeller-driven strategic bomber was over. The legacy of Black Tuesday endures. The B-52 Stratofortress, first flown in April 1952 during the Korean War, incorporated every lesson learned from MiG attacks on B-29s. Speed to evade, altitude to stay safe, electronic systems to jam defenses, and range to strike from beyond enemy reach. The story of Namsi remains a stark reminder that even the most advanced technology can be outpaced, and that bravery and sacrifice define history. The Stratofortress would serve for more than 70 years, ultimately becoming the longest-serving combat aircraft in history, a testament to design principles forged in the crucible of Korea. Modern strategic bombers carry that legacy forward. The B-1 Lancer emphasizes low-altitude penetration at supersonic speed, while the B-2 Spirit relies on stealth to slip past enemy defenses undetected. Both trace their conceptual roots to that October morning when Soviet MiG-15s shattered assumptions about bomber invincibility. Every technological innovation, every tactical adjustment, every design choice echoes lessons paid for with the lives of men who flew into MiG Alley believing their machines were untouchable. The story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of institutional overconfidence and the speed at which military technology can advance. The B-29 Superfortress was not a failed aircraft. It was arguably the finest bomber of World War II, a groundbreaking machine that helped win the largest war in history. Yet by 1951, warfare had moved beyond the capabilities of even the most advanced weapons of the previous generation. What had been devastatingly effective against Japan in 1945 failed catastrophically against Soviet jet fighters 6 years later. For the crews, the shift from confidence to terror happened in minutes. They climbed aboard machines they believed invincible, supported by the unshakable certainty of American air power. When they returned, if they returned at all, they knew that assumption had been shattered along with half their formation. The psychological impact was profound and long-lasting. These were seasoned airmen, accustomed to flak, mechanical failure, and combat over heavily defended targets, yet nothing in their experience had prepared them for an enemy that could outfly and outgun them at will. The Cold War would be defined by this dynamic, a constant race between offense and defense, bomber and fighter, missile and countermeasure. Each side studied the other's capabilities, developing new weapons to exploit weaknesses. The stability of mutual deterrence rested on maintaining bomber forces capable of penetrating enemy defenses, demanding continual upgrades to stay ahead of advancing technology. In this context, B-29 losses over Korea were an early warning. The United States had entered the war confident in its air superiority, bolstered by World War II victories. But Soviet MiG-15s flown by veteran pilots shattered that confidence, forcing rapid adaptation. The American response, the development and deployment of a new generation of bombers within a few years, demonstrated the military's capacity to learn from disaster and evolve. The cost was high. 28 American airmen were killed during the Namsi mission, with 24 more wounded. Dozens of crew members endured years of brutal captivity, and hundreds who survived carried psychological scars for life. The lesson was clear. No matter how advanced or trusted a weapon, invincibility is always temporary in warfare. Yet the knowledge gained shaped the future. American strategic bombers would never again operate in daylight against modern jets without overwhelming escort or decisive technological advantage. Institutional confidence would no longer override tactical reality. The transformation catalyzed by MiG-15s over Korea directly influenced the aircraft and systems defining American air power for generations. The B-52, the B-1, the B-2 all reflect lessons learned at a terrible cost in MiG Alley. In 2008, Fred Meyer, reading from his 67-year-old flight log, spoke for all who experienced the shattering of certainty. These young men had believed their machines were invincible, right up until the moment MiG-15s dove from the Korean sky and proved otherwise. The lesson endures. Technological advantage is fleeting, assumptions are dangerous, and adaptation is survival. On October 23, 1951, 15 minutes of combat over Namsi taught the United States that past victories offer no guarantees. The men who flew B-29s into MiG Alley paid with their lives, yet their sacrifice imparted knowledge that shaped American military aviation for decades. The bombers may have been outmatched, but the lesson was invaluable. Invincibility is a myth. Technology evolves, and those who fail to adapt do not survive. These truths, written in fire over North Korea, remain as relevant today as they were 70 years ago.